Oh, good morning, protege. Of course, good afternoon to my wonderful and favorite eighth period class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is a very special direct instructional Zoomcast, as you'll find out as we get into it, but also because we are now embarking upon the very last major unit of the school year. Boy, has this year gone quickly as it always seems to do. So this is going to be, of course, Unit 6. And this is, again, one of the great units that we are going to cover this year. So relevant, especially now in the 21st century. And that, of course, is the civil rights movement. Here we go. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So everybody at this time should have your ISNs open. You should have your ISNs open to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Make certain, of course, top right-hand corner, you have dated your notes for today. It is, of course, Monday, and it's April 18th. April showers always bring May flowers, and it's 2022. And again, please remember, again, you have your highlighters, correctable tape on your desk, but I'm going to, again, respectfully ask all students to refrain from using it. Rather, I want you to focus on the Zoomcast, focus on taking those really good copious notes, not just the main notes, but adding those additional oral notes, the margin notes. That is something that we really need to continue to hone on and develop as you are, again, beginning that transition very, very shortly to go on to Adelaide E. Stevenson High School next year. Save your correctable tape and your highlighters for later on. Now your job is to be focusing, listening, and again, taking those really good notes. All right, so I'd like you to write this down, top line. So every single page should have a date in the top right-hand corner. Every single page, of course, should have a topic heading or an assignment heading. In this case, since it's direct instruction, it's going to be, of course, a topic heading. So we are now officially beginning, again, Unit 6. And Unit 6, which is the last major unit of the year, is, of course, the Civil Rights Movement. So the Civil Rights Movement technically begins in the year 1954 with a very historic Supreme Court case, which you will be learning about later on. And that's, of course, Brown versus the Board of Education, or Brown v. the Board of Education. And again, the Civil Rights Movement, again, officially ends in 1968 in April as a result of the tragic assassination of course, the main leader of the Civil Rights Movement. And that, of course, is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But as you're going to find out through me, as we get into and really examine the Civil Rights Movement, the roots of the Civil Rights Movement go way back, well before 1954. And so even though technically when you read in terms of the history books that the Civil Rights Movement ended with the tragic assassination of Dr. King in 1968, I'm going to respectfully disagree. I think that, again, the Civil Rights Movement is still going on. It's ongoing today in, of course, April of 2022. All right, so let's continue on. If you would direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this, again, is one of the seminal, most important photographs of the Civil Rights Movement. And this, of course, is the famous, again, march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. This took place, again, in March of 1965. I was, at that point, going to be turning 3 years old, so I do not have a recollection of it. And right here in the middle of this march, that is, of course, the main leader of the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about him. And that, of course, is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, again, Montgomery, of course, is the capital. It was about a 54-mile march. Again, it was meant to push the envelope for civil rights, as you're going to find out. All right, so here's what I would like everybody to do. I would like you to skip a full page, and I would like everybody to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. We're going to come back to those notes in just a moment. Don't you worry. Make certain, again, that you date your notes again for today. It is April 18th, 2022, and it's Monday, as the mamas and papas sang back in the mid-1960s. And I want you to write down for me visual discovery, Jim Crow, and segregation. So what you're going to be doing here, and we will go back to those notes momentarily, but right now, again, we're going to really continue to hone those critical thinking skills that are going to be so important and vital as you make that transition, as you're beginning the transition to go from Aptekissick Junior High to Adelaide E. Stevenson High School. So here's what I would like everybody to do. My dad was a photographer. And when I was a little boy growing up, when my dad was alive, he would talk about how a photograph tells a story, okay? And this photograph tells a very powerful story. So here's what I would like everybody to do. I would like everybody to right now pause the Zoomcast. I want you to take a few moments. I want you to really study and examine this photograph. Then what I want you to do is I want you to keep the Zoomcast paused for the next 3 to 5 minutes. And what I want you to do is I would like for you to write for me a 2-paragraph reflection. Paragraph number 1, real simple. Describe all the details of this particular photograph. Any similarities, comparing similarities, any differences, contrasting between this item on the left and the item on the right. And those items, of course, are water fountains. And then the second paragraph is going to be the harder one, because the first one, you're just describing what you see, what you observe. The second paragraph is, what's the point of this photograph? What's the point the photographer was trying to make when this photograph was taken? What's the story that is being told? Now, when you're done, again, you're going to restart the Zoomcast and we're going to go back to the previous page. So here's what I want you to do. I would like for you to write this excerpt down because we're going to do another reflection on this, okay? So you're going to need to definitely, and you've been doing a really fine job, again, this, over the last several months in particular, of really using, again, the whole point of these Zoomcasts to be able to pause the Zoomcast and to give yourself a chance to get caught up. So these are what we call words of wisdom, okay? Something to think about. And I want you to write this down because when you're done, you're going to write another reflection on this, okay? So here's what I want you to write down for me. Here we go. Aim high, dream big, take risks, make mistakes, and learn lessons from those mistakes. Every mistake is an opportunity to grow, and growth will be an important part of our lives during the next 4 years of high school. Our time at Aptekissick has not necessarily taught us what to think, but how to think. Not what to learn, but how to learn. And that, my friends, is the true measure of our junior high education. So what I would like everybody to do is when you're done, again, writing down this excerpt from a speech, you're going to find out shortly. I want you to, again, pause the Zoomcast. I want you to take about 3 to 5 minutes again. And I want you to reflect for me in your ISN, your history notebook, what was the point that this excerpt from this speech was trying to make? Okay? And then when you're done, start the Zoomcast back up again. I, of course, am going to continue on. So this is actually an excerpt from the graduation speech way back 7 years ago for the graduating class from Aptekissick Junior High of 2015. And those are the words of the person delivering that speech. And his name was Muma Jungmeta, who happened to be one of my former proteges. So this was the commencement address. Now, I've seen a lot of outstanding commencement addresses over, again, the last 32 years at Aptekissick Junior High. And I have to tell you, I would be hard-pressed to find a better speech, a more poignant speech, a more powerful speech, a better delivered speech than what Muma Jungmeta offered to the Aptekissick class of 2015. It was truly special and truly remarkable. So who exactly was Muma Jungmeta? So if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that's a very young photograph of Muma Jungmeta. So Muma Jung Metta and his family were originally from Cameroon, which is in the western part of Africa, and they relocated to the United States of America. If you direct your attention back up to my laptop screen, this is a photograph of the Jung Metta family. This right here is Dala. Dala is the older brother of Muma. I taught Dala also. This is Muma right there, and this is Dr. Jung Metta. All the families that I have worked with, and all the students, over 4,000 students that I've mentored over the last 32 years, are all special and unique in their own way. But then every so often, you run into a family that truly is what Mr. Bonk would call Aptekissic Hall of Famers. And in my humble opinion, this family are Aptekissic Hall of Famers. Truly special, truly remarkable. So Muma was an interesting student. He was an outstanding student, just like his brother Dala. And Dr. Jung Metta and his wife were just wonderful, supportive parents. And I remember Muma being in my class, and this is again over 7 years ago. Second row, fourth seat back. Outstanding note taker, great students, did a wonderful job with his ISN. But not only just was a great student, was just a very special, remarkable student. Great athlete, actively involved in the fine arts. He was in band with Mr. Eifert, our former band teacher. He also sang choir. And the thing that I remember especially about Muma, I have two stories. One is Muma's locker was right outside my classroom, 201. And right next door, of course, is Mr. Podolsky. And every day before school started and between classes, you would see all these students gravitating towards Muma's locker. And all I hear is Muma, Muma, Muma. Muma. There was no doubt in my mind, no doubt in my mind whatsoever, that Muma was easily the most popular kid at Aptekissic Junior High. Truly special. And my other funny story about Muma, not only being such a great student, a wonderful, bright, articulate young man, but a very thoughtful and respectful one who had a nice sense of humor. And so Muma, every so often, he would have to sneeze or would sneeze, and he would need some Purell. And I put it in his hands, and then I would put lotion in his hands too, because he didn't want to get chapped hands, because the alcohol in the Purell would dry your hands out. So I would leave my bottle of lotion up in the front on my cart by the front door. And Muma would walk into my room between classes, and the kids would be coming in and be filling out their songbooks like you guys do. And Muma would walk in, he would take the lotion, put it on his hand, wave to everybody, and everybody thought I was so upset. I thought it was hysterical. And one student said, well, what if you run out of lotion? And I said, I'll just buy another one. And that's why I call it the Muma bottle. And I've actually replaced it multiple times since I had the privilege of mentoring him in 2015. So if you want to know what Muma looks like today, that is a more recent photograph of Muma. He is currently a junior at the University of Wisconsin, and of course, Madison, Wisconsin, the capital. And so next year, when you, my current students, are going to be freshmen at Adelaide E. Stevenson High School, Muma Jung Metta will be a senior at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He plays football there. I believe he'll be playing next year actively. And the talk is he might even potentially be playing in the NFL. We'll have to see. Truly special. So I want to go backwards for a moment, though, and just try to articulate, though. So what was the point behind my story about Muma and, of course, Dala and Dr. Jung Metta? And my point is that when you look at Muma and Dala and the way the Jung Mettas were so well received, and that's one of the special things about District 102 and Aptekissic Junior High, is that everybody treated Dala and Muma and the Jung Metta family with tremendous respect and dignity. There was no doubt, as I said, that Muma, and even when Dala was very quiet, and they were easily some of the most popular kids in the school. But I think about the civil rights movement, and I think about what if there had not been trailblazers in the civil rights movements going way back before the Jung Metta family moved from Cameroon to the United States and eventually settled in Buffalo Grove. If it had not been for people like Booker T. Washington, whom you're going to learn about, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Rosa Parks, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., if it had not been for all these civil rights pioneers, who's to say that the Jung Metta family would have ever had the opportunity of eventually relocating to District 102 and allowing the Jongmeta boys, again, Dala and Muma, to attend Aptekissick Junior High. I've always said that, yes, District 102 provided a true opportunity and a blessing to the Jongmeta family to be able to go to such a wonderful school district. But at the same time, it was an honor and a blessing for all of us, those teachers who were at Aptekissick back when Dala and Muma were there, to have the opportunity of mentoring these two fine young men and having the opportunity of interacting with the Jongmeta family. So that's the connection I'm making with the civil rights movement, because had it not been for those civil rights activists that I mentioned, again, we would have never had the opportunity of being able to share what a wonderful story about the Jongmeta family. So let's continue on. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you would please write this down. So again, to understand how and why families like the Jongmeta family were able to be given the opportunity to go to a great school like Aptekissick Junior High and attend District 102, which is so warm and open and supportive of all students, no matter what your race, gender, creed, etc. is, again, you have to go back in time. So again, whenever I teach the civil rights movement, I don't start with Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954. No, you got to peel back the layers and you got to go back decades. So what I'm going to do today with my direct instructional Zoomcast is I want to go back to the beginnings. These are the roots of where the civil rights movement began. So to me, you have to go back to the very beginning. And it really starts with what I call Jim Crow laws. So this is the period of time between 1876. So this is right at the end of what we call the Reconstruction era, the rebuilding of the United States after the devastation of the Great American Civil War between 1861 and 1865. And so the era of Jim Crow laws was from 1876 all the way until the year 1965. So this is, again, the end of Reconstruction. And then 1965, later on in one of my Zoomcasts, I'll explain why the era of Jim Crow laws officially ended. So Jim Crow laws were laws that were passed, again, primarily, I would say almost exclusively, by the former states in the South that were part of what we call the Confederacy during the Civil War. So if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is, again, a map at the time of the Civil War. So all the states in blue, we call those states the Union. All the states in red, like Texas and Arkansas, and Louisiana, and this is, again, Tennessee, and you've got Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and that's Delaware over there. All those states were part of the Confederacy. These states in blue, of course, were members of what we would call the Union. And then these states in yellow, we call them the border states: Missouri, Kentucky. You've got West Virginia, Maryland. These were states that still allowed slavery, but at the same time, they never officially left the Union, which is another story for another Zoomcast. Let's continue on. So what exactly were Jim Crow laws? So once federal troops officially left the United States, more specifically the former Confederate States of America, in 1877 is when officially, again, the whole idea of Reconstruction ends. And it's when all these federal troops are going to leave the Deep South. This is when the former Confederate states, especially states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and then Alabama, these are some of the biggest ringleaders of it. And these were laws that will basically promote what we call racial segregation, separating Caucasians, white Americans, from African Americans. So, for example, you would see laws passed in the former Confederate states, these Jim Crow laws, where it was basically stated that African Americans were not allowed to drink from specific water fountains. This is the same photograph that you wrote a reflection on for me earlier. So you had white-only water fountains, and you had also African-American water fountains, separating the two races, even though this gentleman, who is African-American, is a citizen of the United States of America. Let's continue on. So When you look at the era of Jim Crow, and you'll hear that a lot, 1876 to 1965. And again, later on, I'll explain why the era of Jim Crow officially ended in 1965. So laws were passed in those former Confederate states that, again, will legally, okay, this is called de jure segregation. These are laws that legally segregated African Americans. So, for example, number one, hospitals. You would have in the former Confederate States in the Deep South 2 different sets of hospitals, hospitals for whites and hospitals for African Americans. And trust me, the hospitals for African Americans are not getting the same quality of care as that for white Caucasians. Number 2, libraries also separated. You had white-only libraries and African American libraries. And if you were African American, you were not allowed to go to those white-only libraries. And trust me when I say this, the volume of books that were available in the African American libraries paled in comparison to those white Caucasian libraries. Schools, probably the worst example of Jim Crow laws. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is a photograph of a 19th century school attended by all these children are African American. And this photograph might look familiar to you because this is the new fine arts wing of Aptekissick Junior High. So here's what I would like everybody to do. Once again, I told you, we're going to be doing a lot more reflecting and writing in our ISN as we continue to hone those critical thinking skills. So I want you on this page to draw a line off to the side, take about 5 minutes, and I want you to compare and contrast these 2 photographs. Compare means how are they alike, and contrast is how are they different. Do you see any similarities between these 2 schools? Do you see any differences between the 2 schools? You explain that to me and for me more specifically. So this should take you about 3 to 5 minutes. I'm going to continue on. All right, let's continue on. So now we're going to move on to number 2. Another major factor or event on the road to the civil rights movement. Again, it officially begins with Brown v. the Board of Education in 1954, which we're going to learn a lot about. So we start with those Jim Crow laws, the era of Jim Crow, 1876 to 1965. It officially ends when I turned 3 years old. And now we move on to a very important court case that's called Plessy v. Ferguson, way back in 1896. So the year is, in order to understand the case Plessy v. Ferguson, you got to go back to the year 1892. So in 1892, this gentleman right here, his name was Homer Plessy. So Homer Plessy was born, they don't know exactly the exact date. It could have been 1862, 1863. It's a little bit vague in terms of the birth certificate. But the bottom line was he was a shoemaker who happened to live in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I want you to take a good, careful look at his photograph because Homer Plessy had a very unique heritage. Homer Plessy was 7/8 Caucasian. His ancestry was French. He was what we call a French Creole. So a big part of his ancestry, his DNA, is French. But Homer Plessy was also 1/8 African American on, again, both his father and especially his mother's side of the family. But at the time, Homer Plessy was able to fairly seamlessly fit in and go about in terms of white society in New Orleans. Well, in 1892, the story is Homer Plessy had boarded a train in New Orleans, Louisiana, and then a problem ensues. So Homer Plessy, who again was 7/8 white Caucasian, he identified himself primarily as a Caucasian with 1/8 African heritage and ancestry. He sat in what was called a white-only car. And the story is that the conductor looked at Homer Plessy and said, you can't sit in this car, you're in the wrong car. And Homer Plessy looked at the train conductor incredulously and said, I don't understand why, I paid for my ticket. And the conductor said, well, you are not, again, 100% Caucasian, you are part African American. And so therefore, the train conductor, again, accused Homer Plessy of breaking a law that was passed 2 years earlier in the state of Louisiana, which was called the Separate Car Act. And what the Separate Car Act did, and I'd like you to draw a line off to the side, was it basically stated that in the state of Louisiana, there were two different sets of train cars, which was the main means of getting from point A to point B. There were white-only cars, and there were also African-American cars. But again, Homer Plessy didn't understand this. He said, I paid my ticket. And even though, yes, I'm of African ancestry, but I'm 7/8 Caucasian, and he identified himself as a Caucasian. He couldn't understand what the issue was. So he refused to get out of his seat. Well, Homer Plessy, as you're going to find out, was eventually arrested. And there's more to the story after that. So the story is that Homer Plessy eventually is going to sue the state of Louisiana because of the fact that he was arrested because he was, again, allegedly breaking the Separate Car Act of the state of Louisiana of 1890. So Homer Plessy is going to sue the state of Louisiana. And his lawsuit basically states that the state of Louisiana was, again, violating three constitutional amendments: the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. So what I would like everybody to do is, you're writing this down, we're going to add some oral notes to this because I think this is important. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are often called the Reconstruction era amendments. So all three of these amendments to the Constitution were passed during the age of Reconstruction between 1865 through 1876/77. So the 13th Amendment, draw a line off to the side, that was the amendment that officially outlawed and banned slavery, going all the way back to its beginnings way back in 1619. The 14th Amendment, draw a line off to the side, this amendment was again ratified. So the 13th Amendment was 1865. The 14th Amendment was ratified 3 years later in 1868. This was the amendment that basically promoted citizenship for all African Americans. And as citizens of this country, they were entitled to the same rights as other citizens of the United States of America. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, draw a line off to the side. Now, this amendment was ratified 2 years later in 1870, and this was the amendment that granted African American men the right to vote. Remember, women, whether you were white, Caucasian, or African American, did not gain the right to vote until, of course, the 19th Amendment, and that's not going to be ratified literally for another 50 years into the future, and that's not until 1920, right in time for the election of 1920, as you learned about in the election between Warren G. Harding and James M. Cox. All right, so now the question is, what happened to Homer Plessy? You're going to find out right now. I would like everybody to skip a full page, go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper, make certain that everybody dates your notes again for today. And on the top line, you're going to write down for me guide questions, Plessy v. Ferguson. So we're going to watch a fairly brief video clip. I found this several years ago, and I think it does a nice job of just kind of filling in the gaps. I just kind of gave you a general overview of the case Plessy v. Ferguson. And then after the video clip, I'm going to dovetail back and summarize its importance. So here we go. So I'm going to again go through these guide questions quickly. So that's why it's important for you to pause the Zoomcast to give yourself a chance to catch up. And remember to skip a couple lines between every guide question. Number one, what is separate but equal? And I'm going to talk about this later on after I summarize Plessy v. Ferguson. Number two, did the Supreme Court support Plessy's argument? Remember, Homer Plessy was, again, 7/8 of French ancestry, white Caucasian. He identified himself as, again, a white Caucasian, 1/8 African American, was asked to leave a white-only car. As a result of, again, according to the conductor, Homer Plessy was breaking the Separate Car Act of 1890. So again, did the Supreme Court support Homer Plessy's argument that those three amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, were they violated as a result of the Separate Car Act of 1890? All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Plessy v. Ferguson.
What happened in the Plessy case was that in June of 1892, Homer Plessy boarded a car of the East Louisiana Railroad that was designated for use by white patrons only. Although Plessy was born a free person and was 1/8 Black and 7/8 white, under a Louisiana law enacted in 1890, He was classified as black and thus required to sit in the colored car. When in an act of planned disobedience, Plessy refused to leave the white car and moved to the colored car, he was arrested and jailed. The Supreme Court upheld the right of Louisiana to have done so. In the Supreme Court's decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, the court upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation, even in public accommodations, particularly railroads, under the doctrine of separate but equal, which was not to be overturned until 1954, when the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education.
Which is another story for another time. All right, so here's what I would like everybody to do. Please go back to the previous page. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize and synthesize the essence of why Plessy v. Ferguson was so important. All right, so a couple of things. Number one, so as the narrator pointed out in that video clip, in 1896, the Supreme Court of the United States of America will rule against Homer Plessy. So basically, the Supreme Court ruled in 1896 that yes, rail cars could be segregated. Segregated means separated. You should mention that as a little oral side note. But there was one caveat, there was one condition. And that condition was that those rail cars could be separate, but they needed to be equal. So you could, according to the Supreme Court, have two train cars, one exclusively for white Caucasians, one exclusively for African Americans, but according to the Supreme Court, they were supposed to be on the same level in terms of the same quality. So yes, Homer Plessy ended up losing this very significant court case. All right, so finally, I'd like you to write this down. So what was the importance of Plessy v. Ferguson? I'm going to tie everything together for you guys. So first of all, number one, it set precedents. It set an example. So basically what the Supreme Court ruled in 1896 that yes, the Separate Car Act, which is an example of what we call a Jim Crow law. You see the way I'm making a connection to the previous topic that I talked about? So basically that Jim Crow law legally segregated or separated whites from African Americans. So now, not only did the Supreme Court in 1896 say, yes, it was perfectly fine for the state of Louisiana to legally segregate whites from African Americans, then other states besides Louisiana, two of the most notorious for this were Alabama and Mississippi, and they're going to start passing other laws. These are all examples of what we call Jim Crow laws. I would make a little notation off to the side that legalize segregation in more areas than just train cars. So how is it that those former Confederate states will legally segregate? These, again, I want to emphasize, ladies and gents, these are citizens of the United States of America, as stated in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So citizens of this country were now legally segregated as a result of Plessy v. Ferguson, whether it could be libraries, they could be restaurants could be legally segregated, schools were legally segregated, parks were legally segregated, theaters were legally segregated, and yes, even public transportation beyond just the rail cars. So I want you to do me a favor. I want you to take a moment. I'd like you to draw a line off to the side where you wrote public transportation. I would like you to pause the Zoomcast for maybe 2 to 3 minutes. And I just want you to describe this photograph and just tell me why this photograph is an example of what we called earlier Jim Crow laws. So in essence, what Plessy v. Ferguson did was it basically legalized segregation of African Americans from 1896 all the way until 1954 with the case Brown versus the Board of Education, which you're going to look at, we're going to study and examine later on. So for 58 years in American history, citizens of this country, African Americans, were denied basic equality and civil rights. So ladies and gentlemen, that's it for my Zoomcast today. So I'd like now everybody to take your correctable tape. We had a lot. We learned a lot today. And I want you to clean up anything you crossed out or traced over. Remember, your ISN, your history notebook, is supposed to be a portfolio of your optimal efforts. Then I want you to take a couple of different colored highlighters. Remember, multiple colors now, tip of the tip. Focus again on those words you can visualize in your mind, persons, places, and things. Don't be highlighting entire sentences. That's just coloring. By doing that, that is, again, reinforcing the information. It's allowing your brain to sort this information and telling a story. It's providing mastery. It's, again, a natural, organic way of allowing your brain to assimilate this information to really be able to master it, as I stated earlier. But you're not done. Remember, take 10 to 15 minutes, and I want you to go over all the information we covered today. Take the opportunity, hand your ISN to somebody in your house, your mom, your dad, a brother, a sister, an aunt, an uncle, a grandma, grandpa, and you channel your inner Mr. Bonk. Maybe you do a FaceTime conversation with some of your classmates or a Zoom conversation, and you channel your inner Mr. Bonk and talk about the story of course, Muma Jongmeta, Aptekisik class of 2015. What is the connection between the Jongmeta family of Buffalo Grove? How is it that they connect and weave in with the story of civil rights? Then talk about what were Jim Crow laws? What was the purpose behind it? When did they start? What was Plessy v. Ferguson? Who was Homer Plessy? Why did Homer Plessy get arrested, as the video clip stated, and removed from that train car? What law was Homer Plessy allegedly breaking? And how is it that when the Supreme Court ruled in 1896, of course, that very famous line, separate but equal, how that sets the wheels in motion for Jim Crow laws and legally, de jure, segregating African Americans from white Americans, even though African Americans are citizens of this country. So I hope, again, everybody enjoyed today's Zoomcast as passionately as I enjoyed teaching it. Again, as I stated earlier, I love all the students, the thousands of students that I have had the opportunity of mentoring, but I've always considered it an absolute blessing and an honor for being given the opportunity of mentoring both Dala and Muma Jongmeta and having the opportunity of being able to get to know the Jongmeta family. Truly, truly a special, remarkable Hall of Famer type of family. So thank you again. And as I always like to say, and by the way, before I wrap it up, so for our next Zoomcast, what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about those pioneers I mentioned earlier, because had it not been for Booker T. Washington and Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, perhaps the Jongmeta family would have never been provided the opportunity of being able to go to such a wonderful district as Aptekisik Trip District 102 and having the opportunity of attending Aptekisik Junior High and having the opportunity of being mentored by yours truly, Mr. Bonk. So as I always like to say, as I wrap up every single Zoomcast, you know, the story may have ended today, but you better believe the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you again so much. And as always, please